welcome back to Public Art 101. Today we're going to talk about budgeting for your public art project. So public art has some unique needs in the budgeting process, as well as some common best practices that we're going to look through today. And there's some pitfalls that people often fall into, as well as some items that often get overlooked. So we're going to touch on all of those things today, just to help you with the planning of your project. So at this point in your process, you've probably put together your project team. You have defined a site, you've come up with some goals and objectives, some hopeful outcomes for your project, and you probably have an overall amount of money that you're going to spend on the project. There are 4 common ways that you might get that amount of money. So let's look at those first, because the way that you get your money often defines some of those outcomes. So the first and probably most common way is to do the design build contract, which is an overall amount of money related to a capital project. I know that's a lot of big words. So what I mean by that is often when a building is being built, they reserve a portion of the budget from that building being built for public art. And that particular amount of money is what's being used for public art. So that's what we mean for that one. And with that particular amount of money, you have to deliver the entire project from beginning to end, all facets of the project within that budget. That happens a lot with cities who have percent for art programs where they define a certain amount of money that goes to a public art program. Now, one of the things that's becoming more and more common in the public art realm is what's called a design-only contract. So what happens with that is often within a construction project, they hire an artist to consult on the project and create a design, some ideas for the site. But the actual implementation of those ideas, the building, the fabrication, the installation of it, is the responsibility of the construction project, not the artist. So in that case, within your goals and objectives, within the defined budget, you're actually just coming up with the idea, the design, the plans, and somebody else puts it into action. What's also getting more and more common, particularly in the private realm, would be an estimate-based project. So that would be a new building's going in, and they say, you know what, we'd really like to have art here, but we're not quite sure how much that will cost. So we want the artist to come to us and tell us how much that will cost for us to put in that art in that site. In which case, the artist is responsible for designing that project based on an idea that they have and what they think will go into that site. That's also similar, but not quite the same as a grant-based project, because you have to come in with the idea. So a lot of times what happens with community groups or even artists themselves is they have an idea that they would like to implement and put into the public realm, but they need to go find money for it. So they create the idea first, define the budget for what that idea will cost, and then go out and try to find grants or other funding sources in order to make that happen. So as you can see, depending on how that money comes to you might define how the budget's being used, because some pieces might be left out based on what the overall scope of work is for that particular project. The way we're going to talk about it today is assuming that it's a complete design build contract. So we're talking about it as though you have one complete set of funds. That's the amount that you're going to work with for the entire project, and that needs to cover all expenses for the entire project from beginning to end. And one of the things we like to say in public art is that there is no more money. So frequently in the construction realm, you'll find that there's a common practice to submit change orders. So a lot of construction and fabrication groups will be like, actually, we gave you this estimate, but here's what it's going to cost, and we need to get a little bit more money to do that. In public art, that doesn't happen, often because we're dealing with percent for art programs that are government-based, or we're dealing with grant funding that is a limited amount of money. The money that you start with is the only money that you have. So any room that you need for play and for modifications and changes need to be accounted for from the very beginning of your project. So we're going to talk about that a few times as we go through this today. So assuming you have your entire project budget, there is a difference between your project budget and your artist budget. So I'm going to use those terms a lot. Let's take a moment to look at what I mean by that. So your project budget is the overall amount that you have to deliver a public art project. Within that overall project budget, There needs to be funds reserved for some of the things that will cost money in order to make this project happen that might not be directly related to the delivery of the art project itself. So when we say project budget, we mean that overall amount of money. So for something like the selection panel, that money needs to be spent before the artist is even in place. So that comes out of your project budget. Also, your project budget is where your project management fees come from. So you need to have somebody who is kind of overseeing the entire structure of your project from start to finish, making sure that all of the steps are completed along the way. Your project manager is a paid position. That should come out of your overall project budget. Within your project budget, you reserve your artist budget. So that is the amount of money that will be delivered fully to the making of the art itself. Now, we want to reserve as much as possible within the project budget for the artist budget so that you get as much value for dollar as possible out of your artwork. But you need to make sure that you understand the difference between who's delivering what aspect of those budgets. There are also some things that might be in your project budget that could also go into your artist budget. So some of the negotiation up front with your artist or within your project team or within the contracting of the artist is going to be specific to who does what. So that might include things like documentation or community engagement. Some of those items that could be from either the project side or the artist side, you need to determine where those funds are being reserved from up front. We're going to talk about contingency more later on, but your project budget should always reserve a contingency because things come up and we never know what those might be. So because we know that there's not going to be any more money, we want to ensure that we have a little bit of room in the budget for those things that might come up. So reserve a contingency within your project budget overall for some of those items along the way. In the artist budget, we will also reserve a contingency, and those might be treated slightly differently throughout the course of your project, and that's what we'll talk about in a little bit more detail as we go on. Okay, so let's dive into the artist budget. So there are some very specific items that should always be in your artist budget. So that would include your artist fees, so that's how your artist gets paid, as well as any of the costs for the actual making of the artwork itself. Those might include community engagement, professional design fees, permits and other fees for the actual making of the artwork or installation, any site preparation costs, the fabrication and construction of the artwork, the installation, any transportation or shipping that needs to happen, and then site remediation is a part of that as well. So fixing any of the damage that was created along the way. There's always a category in your budget line for other. So we know that artists are creating new ways of doing things. That's what's exciting about it. That's what we love about working with artists. But that means that the budget needs to capture the fact that the artist is going to do things that are specific to their way of working and specific to this project. So the other category will include anything that the artist needs to put in to support this actual idea that they're working toward. Other is different than contingency. Contingency is an amount that's reserved right from the beginning for anything else that may come up. So it's that emergency fund kind of situation where you know that you're not going to have access to more money, but you know that likely things will change or adjust along the way. So right up front, we're going to reserve usually 10% in a contingency to make sure that we have funds for that along the way. Artist fees are an often misunderstood category of the artist budget. So the artist fees, I always like to say, are the fees for your brilliant mind. The artist fee is the amount of money that is delivered to the artist directly for doing the work to create the idea and share that idea with the team and ensure that that idea meets the overall goals and outcomes for the project. It's not the making of the artwork itself, it's the idea behind it. So artist fees are usually 10 to 15% of the artist budget, but it is a malleable fee. It's a fee that can be based on demand. So if you are a more accomplished artist, you have a very busy schedule with a really advanced CV, then perhaps you can demand a little bit higher in your artist fee, and that's what people pay to get you to come. If you're more emerging, you might have your artist fees on the lower side. Your artist fees are also a malleable amount within your budget. So, this is important to note because if you don't plan your project effectively, this is one of the only areas in your budget that can move, which means that you would be the one who suffers if you don't plan your budget accordingly. So, that's part of why this budgeting part is really important so that you make sure you factor in all of these expenses that you're going to have along the way right up front so that you're not the one who's impacted at the end. Because remember, being an artist is a skilled labor position. Your role is valuable and you deserve to be paid for your time and for your ideas. There are a lot of tools that you can use in order to support how you come up with your artist fee, so it can be based on a percentage. But you can also use things like Carfac, which is a really great tool. We've got the link on the landing page. It kind of lays out for you how you can structure your fee schedule. So you could do an estimate of your time, you can run that through the Carfac calculator and come up with a good fee based on that time. There are other parts of your project that are included in your budget that you as an artist might get paid for, but they come out of a different budget line item. So, for instance, if as a part of your project, the project team has defined that community engagement is a priority and they want to ensure that engagement is done by you, the artist, so that you're incorporating that into your overall artwork, that means that you need to be paid for the community engagement that they're requiring you to do. That is a separate line item from your artist fee. That also goes for things like fabrication. So there are a lot of artists in the world who come up with their idea, their concept, they draw it out, they have it ready to go and they deliver it to a fabricator who is then paid to make that project a reality. If you as the artist are the fabricator of your own work, you are also paid that fabrication fee for the making of your artwork. Those are separate line items. That might also be things like documentation. Sometimes documentation is a line item where we hire someone else to do the documentation. If you, as an artist, are including documentation as a part of what you deliver, that is a line item that you can be paid for. So make sure that each task that you do as an artist is included within the budget separately from the artist fee, which again is the fee for your idea. Within the artist budget, you have to reserve a large part of your budget for the making of the art itself. That's where we want the most amount of money to go within any of these budgets so that we're actually seeing the results of the budget in the artwork itself.
I would say just being realistic about costs of materials and using estimates on their time realistically. You don't want to underestimate, you don't want to obviously overinflate that time, but making realistic assumptions and then building in contingencies because everything always changes, and having a plan that is flexible so that if costs in the beginning change, you can make small changes without losing the integrity of the project overall. So just having those discussions and that planning aspect to the money and seeing this is a milestone within your project that is absolutely not changeable, but this one probably has a little bit of flexibility in it, and identifying and talking about those earlier so that they have that in the back of their mind, so that things that can change and will are a bit more flexible, and it stops the artist fee at the end being the one bucket that is constantly being taken out of, so that the artist doesn't actually get paid in the end because they've covered all the overages. So you want to absorb that into the project costs rather than the artist fee.
And then, like I said, we want to reserve that 10% contingency right off the top in your artist budget so that you always have a little bit of room. That way, A, we can try to avoid dipping into your artist fee if possible, but B, you have that space within your budget to change things a little as the project progresses, or if inflation hits suddenly and costs of materials go up through the course of your project, because they sometimes take a long time, you have some room in your contingency to adjust for that. And then, of course, things come up. I know we always joke about it here, but there was this one project that we had to work on that needed suddenly a bird and bat study to make sure that the project wasn't going to affect any of the natural habitats within the area when the artwork was being built. So who would have known up front that we needed a bird and bat study as a part of the project? So these things they happen because we're working in the public realm and we're working with art, which has lots of variables. So you want to ensure that you account for that. Within your artist budget, the contingency will always be used by the end of the project. As you go along in your budgeting process, you start with an overall budget. It's kind of big, round, broad numbers, what you expect that it will cost based on the projected outcomes of the project. When you develop your concept, those numbers become a little bit more specific. You've gotten some estimates. You actually understand what materials you're going to use. You start to know what kind of footings you need in the ground. Those details become a little bit more clear, so your budget becomes more accurate. When you get to the detailed design phase, you're down to the penny. You have very, very specific costs outlined for the materials, for the shipping, all of the elements that are being used throughout the course of the project. And then in your final reporting, in your final accounting of how you use the money throughout the development of this project, everything will be laid out specifically and your contingency will be at zero. You will have used the contingency in all aspects of your project. There are some items that cannot be included in the artist budget. And so commonly, these are requests from artists that we include these in an artist budget, but they're actually not considered part of the making of the artwork itself. And those include things like administration of the project. So the time that you spend doing your paperwork for the project, that's just a normal part of project management, and it's not included within the art specific budget. Your insurance costs. So insurance is something that you as an artist should carry in order to protect yourself in the community when you're working in the public realm. It's considered a normal part of doing business. So it's part of your business expenses, not part of your project expenses. So you can't include it in your actual artist budget for a specific project. And things like office costs. We can't pay for a new laptop for you. Your cell phone bill is part of your company. Those are not things that are included in your artist budget. They're part of what you need to do your own practice. So those are kept separately for you. But the next question is, how is this budget delivered to you as the artist? This can be confusing for a lot of people, so let's walk through it with a little more clarity. You have your overall project budget, the overall amount. Then the artist budget. The entire artist budget is delivered to the artist based on the estimated amounts that the artist provides in order to complete the project as a whole. But it's not best practice to deliver that entire amount of money to the artist up front. What we do is we deliver that money through what's called an earned value model or a milestone model throughout the course of the project. So, although the entire amount of the artist budget is delivered to the artist to project manage in the delivery of the artwork itself, we don't give that money to them all at once. We do what's called a scope and fee schedule, which outlines key milestones within the project where portions of that money is delivered along the way. Sometimes in construction land, this is called an earned value model, so you might hear that term come as well. These milestones are places within the project where we can clearly say this outcome has been reached, and therefore we can deliver you a percentage of the budget at this time. What's really important in your scope and fee schedule is making sure that you plan ahead. So, there are some standard practices in how a scope and fee schedule is outlined for you. Frequently, it's 10% upon contracting. So that would be a signing amount that's given to you as the artist so that you can begin your work on the project. There's also usually a completion amount, so 10% reserved at the end of the project for the final paperwork. Things like your stewardship manual being provided to the organization at the end. We reserve a portion for that delivery at the end of the project. The milestones in between may depend on the timeline and the scope of the project. So this is where they can be a little variable, and you want to work with your project manager to outline those milestones in a way that's going to benefit you. So you want to make sure, for instance, that after your concept has been approved and you have a concept delivery milestone, that you get a higher percentage of your budget delivered to you at that time as you go into the detailed design process, because you're going to need to get some estimates. You're going to need to get some contractors in place. You're going to need to build some more design templates as a part of your detailed design. So you want to make sure that you have the funds up front in order to pay who you're going to need to pay as a part of your project. When you get your detailed design approval is when you start to move into installation and fabrication. Well, you need to have the money in order to pay for all of your materials, to pay your fabricators, to pay any shipping costs during that time. So often the biggest chunks of your budget are delivered to you after your concept and after your detailed design approval. You want to work with your project manager to lay out these milestones in a way that are going to work for you. When I do an artist contract, I usually do the scope and fee schedule separate from the contract. They go together, but the scope and fee schedule is an addendum to the artist contract because it's a living document. As projects grow and change, as the timelines shift, as the weather changes, as materials might be back ordered, and things change over the course of a project, sometimes you might have to move those milestones in order to support the project more effectively along the way. So it's a document that can be altered as you go along based on the needs of the project, as long as everybody signs off on it and you have appropriate records throughout the course of the project. So, just to clarify, project budget, artist budget. The artist has an outline of how they're going to spend that money based on the needs of the project, and that money is delivered to them through key milestones throughout the project based on the scope and fee schedule. All of these templates had been provided for you as links on the landing page, so feel free to take a look at those, and hopefully that will clarify things for you even a little bit more. There are quite a few expenses that often get forgotten, and we want to ensure that you have these in your mind up front when you're planning your project so that, again, you can include them in your budget and make sure you're not getting dinged in your artist fee later on. Community engagement is a really important one. Community engagement can take a long time. It can take a lot of hours. You want to make sure that you've budgeted for those appropriately. But also, there's some expenses that come with engagement. Maybe you need to rent a hall. Maybe you need to feed people, because if you feed them, they will come. Maybe you need to provide some materials for some type of workshop or event that you're doing. All of these are costs that need to be accounted for upfront in your budget. Another thing that often gets forgotten is elder fees. So we are working in a country that supports truth and reconciliation protocols. We want to make sure that we're working with our local Indigenous communities as much as possible. And we follow the philosophy of nothing about us without us. So you want to ensure that you are consulting with elders or knowledge keepers within the Indigenous community as a part of your project, particularly if you are using Indigenous content in your project.
There are quite a few different websites you can go to. Um, there are also lots of elders groups who are usually open to students or public that will receive you and give you some knowledge if you have some questions. The Calgary Public Library down at the Central Library has an elders guidance circle, and they have elders in their room all the time, and that's what they're for. You can go there and ask them. There's also the Friendship Center. There's the Indigenous Hub.
Now, that said, if you're going to consult with people, you have to pay them. And so elders have specific protocols that are required for working with them, and that includes payment for their time, as well as gifting and hosting. So food is a really important part of working with elders, and you want to ensure that you include all of that in your budget.
It's better to ask dumb questions than to proceed without knowing where you're supposed to go next and then pretending like you do. It's usually when you mess up.
Engineering fees are professional and design consultation fees. So we do have a line item for that in your budget. But I just want to flag that engineering fees can be quite expensive. So you want to ensure that you have enough money reserved for that up front. A lot of more emerging artists might use engineers that they know, maybe call on family members or friends to partner with them in the project because they are expensive fees to include. But you just want to make sure that you accommodate for that in your budget up front. Health and safety protocols are an important part of an installation, particularly if you're doing a 3D installation that requires any type of construction or digging into the ground. When a project is a part of an overall capital project, so when a public art project is included in a construction project as a whole, often those are already taken care of by the company that's project managing the overall construction project. However, this can come up with community groups quite often if you, say, are installing something in your community garden and it's not part of an existing project, it's a standalone project. These health and safety protocols and other permitting fees that might normally be absorbed into the overall project, you might have to account for those on your own. So ensure that you're aware of what permits you're going to be required to get, what protocols you're going to need to follow so that you can account for those upfront. Fabrication can be expensive and installation can be expensive, but one of the things that often gets forgotten is what it gets installed on. Now, again, if you're part of an overall construction project, likely they've considered that already and they've worked you into their overall planning for making sure they're putting footings into the concrete before they close the concrete up. But if you're installing a project that's separate from a construction project, you need to ensure that you have what you need in order to install that project safely so that it doesn't get knocked over or fall over or blow away in the wind. So making sure that you have those basic construction elements in place and budgeted for as a part of your project. Life cycle planning is expensive. So we need to ensure in your project budget, not your artist budget, your project budget, that you've reserved a portion of your funds for the future care and maintenance of your artwork. We want it to live as long as possible in the best state as possible in the public realm. There's weather to consider, there's vandalism to consider, there's repair over time that needs to be considered. And you need to reserve a portion of your money to make sure that you can care for this artwork into the future.
So, strategic planning for looking after the collection. We have a large collection. A lot of it is out into the public spaces, and Calgary is not the easiest environment. Um, there are the usual, vandalisms, wear and tear, unexpected events, and so we we do strategic planning in with the conservation team in like 10-20 year cycles, depending on the condition reports, so we can identify which artworks are more critical for preventative treatments, because what we've seen over and over again is the more money you invest up front in preventative maintenance on any kind of infrastructure, including artwork, you don't spend on the surprises at the end, right? So those more immediate needs, when an artwork possibly has a crack or it needs repainting, and you have to do those things in a hurry, and you have to, if there's a safety issue, then obviously the costs escalate. And if we can use the condition reporting to identify on a longer scale and obviously match that to the allotted budget that we get through our budget cycles, then we are cost saving, looking after our assets in the same way that you would look after a bridge or a road or anything else that the city does. For long-term care, keep a maintenance budget if you have an artwork that that you think is susceptible to those things. People love to do murals. Keep 10% back in your community association fund as part of the budget, depending on how that will be possible, depending on how you've got the money. Sometimes they won't let you hold money, so that money may have to be raised separately, sort of as a cash supplement. But I would do that because it's very easy to create projects and have exciting projects in the beginning, and then 10 years down the line, you're giving somebody else a problem where the paint won't last that long, or the sun shines on it and it's fading, and you need to think about the future of that project for the people that are looking after it. And being a good community association member, not just dumping like the hard part of the project, which is the continued care.
I like to bring up celebration as well. You do all this work to put an artwork into the ground, and sometimes then it just goes in and it's forgotten. And a celebration is one of the most important parts about putting the work in the ground. You want people to be excited, to know the story of how it was created, to honor all of the elders, all of the community engagement that went into the making of that project. So bring people together in order to share the story through celebration and to highlight to the public what this work means to the community. Celebrations cost money, so you want to ensure that you have some money reserved for that upfront. And we also want to consider documentation. So documentation of your project is really important in that storytelling piece. It ensures that you have material for your legacy of the project, whether you include that online, in some of your newsletters, any of your social media. It's part of the storytelling, but also the record keeping of the project as a whole. Documentation is its own art form. You want to hire a photographer who's really good and who shows off the work in the best way possible. Maybe you want a video of the public engagement and how you worked with people. All of this needs to go in your documentation, and it needs to be part of what's budgeted for upfront. There are ways to scale your project. So that's one of the other things to know is as that project evolves over time from concept to detailed design to actual, sometimes what you had in mind at the beginning can't quite be done within the budget that you have because remember, there is no more money. So unlike a construction industry where you might apply for a change order in order to do what it was originally planned, within public art, we frequently have to scale the project differently in order to continue to deliver based on those objectives, but within the defined budget that we have up front. So scaling your project can happen in a lot of different ways. It might mean that you use different materiality. It might mean that you change the size of something. It might mean that you don't address all 4 walls on a building. Maybe you only do 3. There are a lot of ways to scale a project in order to still get a wonderful outcome, but that radically reduce the amount of money that you need to spend on certain components within the project.
Okay, Poetic Park had a very low budget and it's a very small piece of land. So basically, it was all set up to have a tiny little sculpture because there was no budget for anything else. But we decided to switch the scales. It was such a small plaza that we said, let's go big, And the budget was so low that we could not have a lot of bronze. So we could not. I mean, so this is what we did. We said, okay, it has to be one mold for both pieces, and the pieces have to be 2 pieces. They have to be able to look like 2 different insects. So we broke them into 3. We created ABC, right? 3 different elements, and all the 3 different elements were made individually, so they were different. So then, and they came out of one mold. So that allowed us to cast 2 of each, but instead of ABC, interchange them. So you've got ABC, and then another one was A or BAC, and that immediately changed the insect, and it just made it a lot more interesting, Yeah.
One very interesting thing is in the way we thinking in the concept and then thinking in the budget. This as I feel like you have this pressure, but we have the idea to just play with that and then thinking a little bit out of the budget and then play with the concept. So once in a while we start doing that, it just everything start flowing, because when you find the right idea or the right thing, it's just incredible because you feel it has to happen. And an inclusive, you start creating different options, different prototypes, different models. With us, we on the end us do it because we present different options, and then there's say, well, I love this. I prefer this with that. It's more expensive, but let's go.
Community engagement is really expensive. And so, one of the easiest ways to scale is to scale back your community engagement to ensure that you only engage on specific items that you can see reflected in the final artwork. Broad scale community engagement that involves everybody can take hours and hours and hours with no really clear directed outcome. So, make sure your engagement also is accurate, specific, and confined within your budget. That will help you scale it appropriately as well. And I just want to reiterate, artists, know your worth. A lot of times, particularly with emerging artists, we get so excited about finally seeing something that we've created put into the public realm that we really want to make it as big and amazing as possible in order to get it out there. And I get that. But your work is valuable and your time is valuable. Your ideas are yours, and you need to ensure that you are paid for the time that you put in to making a project a reality.
Value your time. Like, it's just really important that artists value their time, and you are as valuable and as monetarily important to a project than maybe some of the professional designations. Because it doesn't have a professional designation, doesn't make it free, doesn't make it cheap, and it doesn't make it not valuable. It's really important. You're being paid for your creative mind and thoughts and expression. And that's worth something very valuable.
Make sure you include an artist fee that is acceptable for the amount of work that you're providing, and really know that this is a career choice and that it requires you being paid for what you do. Know your worth, include it. And to any of you who are employing artists, please know these are skilled laborers who have perfected their practice over time. Please pay them accordingly for the work that they do. So that's some pretty high level understanding of what happens in a public art budgeting process. I hope this has helped you understand a little bit more about some of the terminology and the ways that we work within a public art budget. Stay tuned for our next session, session 4. We're going to be talking in detail about artist selection and contracting.